Can somebody else record it just in case it doesn't work with me? It says recording. It says recording. That's fine. Okay. I'm sorry. Now we go back to you.
Could you please, Nora, could you please ask Gina to let you know how to make Mariusz the co-sponsor? Because he wants to share his screen, and unless he's
okay, so how do I make you co-sponsor, Gina?
If you hover your mouse on Mariusz.
Yes.
Share screen. The three dots.
Wait a second.
You could make him co-host.
Okay, I have him on Mariusz, and now I make it co-host. Make co-host. Very good. Make co-host Mariusz. Yes, that's it. So now, how do you make it bigger?
Now just close your presentation, because now I'm close screen share.
Screen share. Close screen share. Screen share. Stop share. Okay.
Okay. Now I'm trying to.
Are you going to be sharing now?
Yeah.
Very good.
Do you see my presentation, right? Yeah.
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, so thank you, Nora and Ariela, for organizing this wonderful evening, and I feel really honored that my book, Polacos in Argentina, Polish Jews, Interwar Migration and the Emergence of Transatlantic Jewish Culture, has won the best award of the LAJSA. And once again, my congratulations to my co-winner, Laura. I will start with saying a few words about what first made me do research on Polish Jewish immigration to Argentina, and then I will move to speaking about the structure of my book, and I will offer a few case studies. Wrapped up in one sentence, my book deals with the Polish Jewish immigration to Argentina in the 1920s and 1930s, and gives a special attention to Yiddish culture as a space linking Poland and Argentina. And when I was embarking on this project, I was struck by a number of issues. First, by how the agricultural colonization in Argentina was and is overshadowing the urban experience of the immigrants. Iwan Cierchowski's book, Recuerdos de Moses Vizie, very well shows the way how the colonization in Jewish farming became a part of Argentine Jewish mythscape and of Argentine Jewish mythology. It seemed to me that the urban experience of Eastern European Jewish immigrants, and specifically Buenos Aires Yiddish environment, didn't get enough attention, both in the scholarship and in the way how Argentine Jewish history is being popularly narrated. Second, I was surprised that many authors and Jewish Argentines themselves perceived leaving Poland for Argentina as a very natural development. I don't need to say that most of the people stayed where they were, and didn't live nor for Argentina, nor for Palestine, nor didn't prepare for immigration. I came to the conclusion that, in fact, we knew very little about what the future immigrants knew about Argentina, via what channels did they gather the knowledge, and more broadly, what was the elite and popular discourse on Argentina in Eastern Europe. And it was important for me to see the Jewish immigrants as independent actors, as people with agency, designing their own future, and not as passive victims of oppression and discrimination. And the third issue, which I had at the beginning, was the narrow perspective on the meanings of the country of origin of immigrants. While now we take it for granted that the place from which we come from possesses multiple and critical meanings for the immigrant population, and Laura's book, dealing precisely with the meaning of ethnocultural origin, is a good example for it. In the context of immigration from Eastern Europe, the divorce from the past and unquestioned desire to forget and shed the past away has been for many a very, very valid and very universal perspective. And the goal of my book was to examine what meanings had Eastern Europe and Poland specifically for those Jews who settled in Argentina. So my book was kind of born out of this, in the context of these issues and of these problems, and I was kind of struggling to find a proper solution to face them. So let's now have a look at the table of contents of my book. The first two chapters explore the Jewish discourse in Poland about Argentina. The fourth and fourth chapters analyze the travel books of Peretz Hirschbein and Hersch David Nomberg, two East European Jews who visited Argentina in the early 20th century and participated in the process of transmitting the knowledge about Argentina. The fifth chapter analyzes the tensions that accompanied the formation of Argentine Jewish identity among immigrants, while chapters 6 and 7 focus on the Landsmannschaften, that is hometown societies and the transnational solidarity networks. The last chapter, chapter 8, analyzes the significance of Eastern Europe for Argentine Jews and the perception of the old world from Argentina. So I will move now to offering you some, free case studies. I will start with the way how Polish Jews imagined Argentina. Initially, at the very end of the 19th century, immigration to Argentina was discussed only in the elite Polish or Hebrew press and was approached very, very ambivalently. For instance, in 1901, a Polish language Jewish weekly, Israelita, Jakub Kohn applauded the colonization in Argentina. He believed that for those Jews who, quote, suffocate in poverty, end of quote, would do anything to live fresh in Poland. The task of the Jewish elite was to assist fellow co-religionists whom, quote, circumstances had brought to the verge of an abyss, end of quote. On the other hand, Nahum Sokolov, writing several years earlier for the same journal, was convinced that the emigration couldn't be a solution for the entire Jewish nation, even not for the poor with no prospects. Sokolov believed that Polish masculine knew the people better than Western Europeans, men of charity, such as Baron de Hirsch, and saw more room for the social work in Poland rather than for rushing with immigration. Some privileged Polish Jews regarded emigration as a form of defeatism and an implicit acknowledgement that Jewish integrationist circles had nothing to offer the poor. In the interwar years, Argentina was essentialized and exoticized in Yiddish popular discourse in interwar Poland. This obviously referred to women trafficking and Jewish prostitution in Argentina. Polish Yiddish newspapers were flooded with reports about young women being forced into sex work on the other side of the Atlantic. As an example, serves this article from the Hind Daily. Wie Weissklavenhändler vernahren die jüdische Mädchen von Polen in Argentina, which means how the white slave traffickers seduced Jewish girls from Poland to Argentina. Those articles had a chilling effect on immigration as such and female immigration specifically. Even though the Jewish prostitution was something absolutely common in Eastern Europe, the link between migration, Argentina, and sex work appeared in the news as horrendous and unexpected. No, I'm not sure if everyone is muted because I hear different voices. So if you could make sure that you are all mute, it would be very helpful. Thanks. Another issue I want to mention are the Landsmannschaften, that is hometown societies established by immigrants in Argentina. Many people associate Landsmannschaften only with the post-Holocaust activity, with the Landsmannschaften being involved in publishing the so-called Yizkor-Bücher, that is memorial books of the vanished Eastern European Jewish communities. In order to offer a more nuanced picture, I look at the pre-1939 activities and suggest that Landsmannschaften were not insular gatherings centered on the past, but rather spaces of ethnic empowerment, which focus on the Argentine future of their members. I see the Landsmannschaften and specifically Polischer Verband, the most influential Polish Jewish organization, as a space which allowed the migrants to combine their Jewish ethnic belonging with the process of acquiring Argentine identity. A good example are here the regular picnics organized by the Polish Verband. The very practice of communal picnics was something specific for many groups within the Argentine society. The picnic organized by the Polish Verband in 1933 included an actress, Renée Waxman, who didn't perform in Yiddish, but recited poems in Spanish by a Nicaraguan poet, Rubén Darío. During another picnic, played both a Jewish and Italian and an Italian orchestra, and essentially Argentine foods such as the asado were served. While the cultural program and the food is an evidence of the process of becoming Argentines, the picnics, which included only Jews, mark the borders of the community. As I mentioned at the beginning, the Yiddish-centered Yiddish politics and culture has served as an important link between Polish Jews in Argentina and Polish Jewish community in Poland.
Yes.
As an example can serve the campaign organized in 1931 for the benefit of the secular Yiddish schools in Poland, the LAJSA schools.
Yeah.
The Polish Verband developed an ethnic discourse shaped by solidarity towards the fellow Jews in Poland.
Mariusz, I would like you to know we have 6 other people who are going to be presenting, so we'd like to.
Yeah. I'm on time. I will be, within this 12 minutes limit. Thank you.
Very good, thank you.
According to the understanding of the landsman, the Jewish Poland provided them with a cultural capital, meaning Jewish education and a space for political and cultural development, which they were supposed to repay by offering the financial assistance to the Jewish educational initiatives. As many members of the Polish Verband were rooted in the progressive Jewish politics, the LAJSA schools, which symbolize the progressive and secular variation of the Polish Jewish life, they found a significant support among Polish Verband members. The campaigns addressed the broader Argentine Jewish public, but the leaders of the Polish Verband played a key role in the fundraising effort. The fundraising campaigns defined the Polish Jews in Argentina as committed both to their native country and to modern Jewish social and cultural causes. At the same time, marking their help as Argentine Jewish assistance, the supporters raised the claim for Argentina's place within the topography of the Jewish world. And I think I need to finish right now, and I just hope that that my book will be useful for you, both for research and for teaching. And I think I pass the mic to Laura.
Very good.
Thank you
very much. Thank you, Mariusz. We shall continue with Laura Limonic, Kugel and Frijoles, Latino Jews in the United States. Laura, let me find you.
I'm here.
I'm
also going to share my screen.
So share screen.
And I think. Can you just make me a co-host so I can share my screen?
Share screen. Let me see. I put share screen.
No.
I know I have to point to you first, and then co-host. Yes. Co-host. There you go.
Okay. Share screen.
You have it?
Yep. There we go. And then play from start. There we go. Okay.
Why don't I don't see you? We don't. Does everybody see what you're going to show us?
I'm screen sharing. Does it work?
But I don't see your slide. Is everybody seeing your slide?
It's fine.
Sí se ve.
Okay, muy bien.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Let me go back because now I don't see it. Sorry.
I don't see it either.
Now do you see it?
I don't.
No.
No. Now I tried to do something to make sure you could see it. Let me 1 second. Let me just do this one more time. Share screen. Continue. I'm sharing my screen. Okay, so it should work. Do you see it?
Yes, correct.
Okay. Okay. So first, thank you for this great honor. I have been coming to LAJSA conferences since I was a grad student and started this project, and I think the project has come a long way, but I have also learned so much from everyone and really the community. And every time I hear another talk, I think, oh my God, there's so much I don't know. But that's actually what's so wonderful of being part of this community. So I'm grateful and thank you. I am, okay, here we go. So this project, I'll just talk, I will try to be brief. And I will talk a little bit about how I started this project, and really what I hope to uncover, and what the larger questions became along the way. So I really started this project as part of my own lived experience as an immigrant, and I always say that immigrants, I think, make the really great sociologists, because we're such good studiers, right, as students of culture. In part because we want so much to just kind of be like everybody else. So I grew up in suburban Boston, and in a town that was predominantly Jewish, a large number of Jews lived in Newton, Massachusetts, where I grew up. And people would say, wait, but you guys are that family, that Spanish family. You know, they would come over to our house, and this is where people would film us for their Spanish class. So we were very exotic, but we were also Jewish. And I was blonde, but my brother was Fernando. So, you know, it was this sort of dichotomy, but are you Jewish? Are you Latino? How can you be both? And I remember thinking, our grandmothers probably grew up right next to each other in the same shtetl, you know, just because my mom's Yiddish is a little bit different, doesn't sort of mean that our worlds are so different. But really, it does, but it doesn't. And that's really where this project came about, right? And it's this idea that, ethnicity and ethno-identity and ethno-religious identity is not just born out of the self, but it's born out of a context. And the context is your community, but it's also the sort of larger structural world in which you reside and your community resides. So there's a lot that makes up how we identify and how we are allowed to identify, right? There's what borders we're allowed to cross. And throughout my research, I began really sort of informally reaching out to other people and asking, you know, well, you're Venezuelan and you're Jewish, and do you feel like you have a relationship with Mexican Jews? Are you more Jewish sometimes? Do you ever feel that you can be part of the larger Latino non-Jewish population in the United States? So what does ethnicity really mean? How salient is it? And where and how does it change given the sort of larger structural forces with which we find communities in? So, you know, I have really just a brief 10, 12 minutes, so I will go through sort of the larger findings briefly, but I think it's very difficult to say, well, all Latin American Jews are one, because we know, particularly this group knows probably better than others, that that's not necessarily the case. But what I did find was that there's some larger structural forces in Latin America that help create a kind of Jewish community that then creates a Jewish identity that is very different from a Jewish identity in the United States, regardless of what Jewish sub-ethnic group you belong to. So, you know, I love this story because it sort of tells this. We think of you know, Moisesville and the Argentine gaucho, the Jewish gaucho, as what, you know, the mythology of an Argentine Jew, and so there's sort of the dichotomy of what we think Jews and you know, the story of what being Jewish in Latin America is, but also what the reality of it is compared to the reality of being Jewish in the United States. And I think one of the things that came up a lot is that there is very much a national culture, right? This is the Hebraica Jewish Argentine soccer team in front of the Kotel in Jerusalem. And then this is another great picture of a kosher taqueria in Mexico. So national culture very much plays a role in national Jewish identity. But the larger difference in what you sort of get once you leave Latin America among Jews is that Latin American Jewish communities have developed within structures that really fomented strong ethno communities. And they might be ethno-Jewish communities, sub-ethnic Jewish communities, Syrian communities, Italian communities. We know that there is a large ethnic Arabic communities in Latin America, and in large part this happens because the state doesn't provide for many social classes the kind of services that these ethnic institutions are able to provide, which as a result create strong ethnic institutions. In the case of Jewish institutions, strong ethno-religious institutions that don't necessarily revolve around the synagogue. So Jews in Latin America can have very strong Jewish lives without necessarily adhering to very strong religious Jewish lives. And that's not necessarily the case in the United States. Well, you know, there are strong Jewish institutions in the United States that don't sort of hold the same strength to create a strong non-religious Jewish identity. And in large part, it's because religiosity in the United States is very different. And it's kind of it was not at the point where Jews became assimilated, it was not okay to be ethnic, but it was okay to be religious, right? So it was okay for there to be synagogues next to your Irish Catholic Church and your Roman Catholic Church, but there was sort of this all European immigrants that became over time part of the larger mainstream. So this is the context where Latin American Jews are coming into. And I really began to want to know, well, does that, you know, that has an effect on how Jewish life is practiced differently here in the United States. So do people that come from Latin America and immigrate to the United States have a strong Jewish identity, given that perhaps it's practiced much differently than it was in their home country? Or do they have a strong Latino identity, or do they form a new identity as Latino Jews? So one of the things that came up very often was this idea of religiosity and the absence of strong non-religious Jewish ethno institutions here in the United States. So many folks said, well, you know, I'm Jewish, but it's a different kind of Jewish life here. That doesn't mean that folks didn't identify as being Jews. In fact, just the opposite. But oftentimes there was, you know, they would say, well, you know, it fulfills some sort of function in my larger life, but it's not the kind of Jewish life that I would have had. But there's also very much a Latino connection. And I think one of the things that came out and became super interesting in this study for me was the evidence that points to a Latino cultural identity. So social scientists often talk about the construction of pan-ethnic identity as something that is born out of either a political ideology or comes from a census classification. But I found that it's much more than that. So folks have many different identities from which to draw on. And the non-material culture of Latino identity, even if folks come from different countries with very different national cultures, is something that they can hold on to here in the United States. And it cuts across class, and it cuts across race, and it cuts across religion. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the primary identity, but it is a connection that people have. But I don't have enough time to talk about race, class, and privilege, but I think it's important to point out that as a group, Latino Jews in the United States absolutely feel like they're in a racial and privileged class as compared to the larger Latino population. But the sort of culmination of my questions was really to think about, okay, well, sometimes folks feel like they belong to the Jewish community in the United States, sometimes the Latino, but but there was always, well, I always feel more comfortable with Latino Jews, whether it's an Argentine with a Venezuelan Jew or a Mexican with a Colombian Jew. You'd say, well, we just have we just understand each other. Sometimes that's a sort of created understanding, but other times, and what I found was that it really, ethnic and ethno religious, pan-ethno-religious communities were constructed. And it really had to do with demographics, so who came, when they're coming into the community, and what the community looks like. And what we know is that who's coming, so I really did a comparison between New York and Miami. And what I found was that when folks come with their families, they're much more likely to seek out institutions. And we know this to be true in the literature, particularly in, that's my timer, so I will stop quickly. But we know this to be true within religious institutions. And when they come with families, they're much more likely to need institutional support, be it the synagogue, be it a preschool, be it some sort of, educational or even network. And that's what happens in Aventura, but not necessarily what happens in New York, because the people that come to New York tend to come as singles or married. Whereas people that come to South Florida the families tend to come to South Florida because the cost of entry is much lower. And the most interesting thing I think I found was the kind of Jewish community that exists, that already exists, is an important factor in how communities develop. So in South Florida, particularly this area, is an area where the existing Jewish community was sort of dying out. So people were either moving north, they're bypassing Miami and North Miami altogether, moving north to Broward County, and even further north, or they're old synagogues that are dying out, which means that Latino Jews or Latin American Jewish immigrants that came had a point of entry to recreate a sense of community. And that's exactly what happened, compared to New York, where in New York they have strong Jewish synagogues, they might have strong Jewish day schools, and there's really no room to create an institution where Jews of many Latin American countries come together, which is what you see in Miami and what you find in Miami. And this is what social scientists really think about when they think that pan-ethnicity is not just a sort of thought that people have, but it's actually happening, is that you start to see coupling off and marriages from people across different national origin groups, which is exactly what happens here. So that's when you really start to see a sort of true pan-ethnicity here in Miami, which doesn't happen in other places. So there's the structural forces are really what have created a pan-ethnic identity. And I think I don't know I apologize, my screen stopped sharing, but I will stop because I think I'm up to 12 minutes. And I can answer questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. Indeed, how much we learn from each one of our presentations in the course of the years in LAJSA, and I hope that we'll be able to continue for a long time. The next one I will not stop you, but if you remember that we try to limit to 10 minutes because we have 5 more people presenting, and then we have a little time for questions. So the next person will be Mónica Szurmuk, Vocación desmesurada, una biografía de Alberto Gerchunoff. Mónica?
Yes, thank you very much. And I think I'll shift to Spanish and start my session.
There you go.
I'm not sharing a screen. Can everyone listen? Okay, great. So I'm now going to shift to Spanish. I would like to, les quiero agradecer mucho a Nora y Ariela esta posibilidad y esta plataforma para escuchar y compartir los libros que se publicaron estos 2 últimos años. Yo voy a hablar de La vocación desmesurada, una biografía de Alberto Gerchunoff, que fue publicada en Buenos Aires por Sudamericana, Penguin Random House. Y es y les quiero pedir, quizá antes de empezar, veo que hay gente que no está muteada, si quizá los administradores pueden mutear a todos, porque veo que hay participantes que no tienen muteado el teléfono.
Okay, can we mute everybody? Mute, I don't know. Go ahead, I'll try.
Okay, great. Muchísimas gracias. Entonces, esto es una biografía intelectual de Gerchunoff, cuando yo empecé a escribir esta biografía, que obviamente no empezó como una biografía, yo venía escribiendo otro tipo de textos, principalmente textos académicos, y la lengua en la que interactuaba era el inglés. La figura de Gerchunoff surge como eje de la biografía porque me interesaba confrontar dos bibliografías importantes en nuestro campo. La primera es la bibliografía de Judaic Studies, que es una biografía que, como dicen scholars como Sandra Glickman, ha tomado, ha normalizado el caso norteamericano, el caso estadounidense, y en el caso de la experiencia de los judíos latinoamericanos, ha estado absolutamente silenciada, no es parte de la tradición central de Judaic Studies, funciona muy marginalmente, y lo que yo notaba era que a través de Gerchunoff yo podía contar una historia que me interesaba contar y que tenía que ver con otras investigaciones que había hecho, que era la historia de los judíos en los primeros 50 años del siglo XX. O sea, y me parecía que era fundamental contarla desde fuera del centro, por alguien que se creía parte del centro. Gerchunoff, como muchos de ustedes saben, nació en la zona de residencia, llegó a la Argentina a los 7 años, y antes de cumplir los 30 era ya una figura fundamental y lo que podemos llamar como el fundador de este campo que nos convoca hoy, que es el campo de los estudios judíos o estudios judaicos latinoamericanos. Él pensaba en sí mismo como parte de este mundo judío que incluía desde Marcel Proust hasta Stefan Zweig, y también incluía estos desarrollos que tuvieron lugar en esa primera mitad del siglo XX y que indudablemente pasan a desplegarse de un modo terrible durante la Shoah y después en la creación del Estado de Israel, un evento político en el que Gerchunoff participa muy activamente a través de su trabajo en la agencia judía para conseguir los votos en las Naciones Unidas, los votos de los países latinoamericanos, para apoyar la creación del Estado de Israel. A esto él dedica los últimos años de su vida. Entonces, yo quería contar esa historia que de los judíos en la primera mitad del siglo, pero no la quería contar desde París o de Londres o de Berlín o de New York, sino que la quería contar desde alguien que desde Buenos Aires se creía parte de este círculo internacional transatlántico de la cultura judía. La segunda gran bibliografía con la que yo interactuaba era la bibliografía de la cultura latinoamericana en general, los estudios latinoamericanos, y en menor medida este pequeño departamento dentro del el gran aparato, la gran residencia que es los estudios latinoamericanos, que es los estudios judíos latinoamericanos. Gerchunoff, creo que todos podríamos estar de acuerdo, es un lugar común decir que él funda la cultura latinoamericana judía, aunque él lo hace con un gesto extraordinario, que es que él no hace este gesto performativo de la fundación, sino que es un gesto completamente diferente, que es el decir, bueno, la lengua, el castellano es una lengua judía, es la lengua de los judíos medievales en España, y lo que él hace es retomar esta lengua y escribir este libro que se publica con bombos y platillos en 1910, con el subsidio y el auspicio de la Comisión Nacional del Centenario, y que lo transforma él en un escritor bestseller. Es un escritor que desde antes de cumplir 18 años ya estaba trabajando en el diario que será su casa intelectual durante más de 40 años, que es el diario La Nación, el diario más importante de América Latina en ese momento, en el que publicaban figuras como Rubén Darío, que ya mencionó Mariusz al principio, Alfonso Reyes, Gerchunoff se transforma en la figura del diario La Nación, invita a Borges a publicar sus primeros textos en castellano al regreso de Borges de Europa, tiene actuación política en la Argentina, tiene una actuación muy, muy rica en lo que, usando un anacronismo para ese momento, pero lo voy a usar para movernos más rápido, podríamos llamar derechos civiles o derechos humanos. Entonces, me interesaba ver además cómo esta figura que había sido central en la cultura latinoamericana, él establece, o sea, además de todo, él es un escritor que tiene que muy anclado en Buenos Aires, tiene una mirada transnacional hacia Europa y Estados Unidos, centro del mundo judío, y hacia el resto de América Latina, y tiene una mirada absolutamente latinoamericana, con relaciones muy fuertes con intelectuales de toda América Latina, y este es el capital cultural y el capital social que le va a permitir la última intervención importante en su vida, poquito antes, los últimos 2 años de su vida, que es esta participación en la creación del Estado de Israel. El libro, después de un proceso largo de decidir cómo publicarlo, en qué lengua publicarlo, el libro fue publicado en castellano, fue publicado en una editorial que tiene una llegada muchísimo más amplia que la que suelen tener las editoriales universitarias. Requirió un trabajo de archivo enorme porque el término, el adjetivo que uso en el título, que es desmesurado, Gerchunoff era más que nada alguien que transitaba la desmesura, y esta desmesura, esta participación en múltiples mundos, hacía que la biógrafa, que era yo, tuviera que repartirme en múltiples archivos, en algunos en los que Gerchunoff era fundamental, como su propio archivo, como el archivo del diario La Nación, y en otros donde quizá encontraba solamente una carta, como es el archivo de Valle Inclán. Y su participación además en múltiples mundos, múltiples lenguas, hablaba 5 lenguas, estaba aprendiendo hebreo en el momento de su muerte, para poder viajar a Israel y participar en hablar, llegó a dar algún discurso en hebreo antes de morir. Entonces el libro intenta dar cuenta de estos mundos, pero dar cuenta de estos mundos de un modo que puedan servir a académicos y académicas, pero que también puedan hacer un puente con una población general, con lectores y lectoras que les interese el tema, y ese ha sido un poco el resultado de la experiencia. Todo el aparato teórico y crítico está relegado a notas al pie, y el tipo de recepción que ha tenido en cuanto a reseñas demuestra que además de todo es posible hacer estos puentes, y me parece que es una figura, primero me parece que es una figura fundamental para los que hacemos estudios judíos en América Latina, y me parece que además es una figura, perdón, tengo un segundo, es una figura fundamental para entrar desde los estudios judíos latinoamericanos a una gran discusión de Judaic Studies, porque creo que Gerchunoff como figura, y muchos de los que lo acompañaron, y muchas de los que lo acompañaron, nunca se pensaron subalternos, marginales o tercermundistas, entonces creo que nosotros tampoco lo tenemos que hacer, y me parece que él es una punta de lanza en ese camino. Bueno, muchísimas gracias.
You have to unmute yourself, Nora.
Yeah, I was just thinking, Monica, and I apologize for at the beginning, I didn't get your picture right. It took me a little while, so now we all see you. Thank you very much. The next speaker will be Mir Yarfitz, Impure Migration and Jews and Sex in Golden Age Argentina, a topic very familiar to me, as you know. So Mir, are we here? Let me see you. Mir, there you go. Thank you.
Hi, so I'm really excited to get to learn more from and share my work with this group of the world's experts in Latin American Jewish history. And I have tried to target my remarks to this audience, so I'm not going to give a traditional book talk. I'm going to focus today on the most controversial issues which have arisen over the course of researching and following up on this book. And I would, of course, like to acknowledge my debt to Nora Glickman, who, as you all know, has over these decades brought really critical primary sources related to this subject into international scholarly and popular conversations. So I have found that some of the foundational arguments underlying this book have been more controversial in Jewish studies spaces than in Latin American studies, or certainly sort of women, gender, and sexuality studies, though the latter depends on the generational and political position. And one ongoing conversation I've been having is about why that is. So some of us did a roundtable at the LAJSA a few weeks ago on kind of putting the sex back into sex work. And I certainly feel like sexuality as a subject area is more controversial in Jewish studies than in, say, Latin American studies. And for those of us in specifically Latin American Jewish studies, particularly those who've been around for a while, the history of Argentine Jewish prostitution might seem like a topic on which a lot has been said, maybe even enough has already been said. So why say more on this topic? Why a whole monograph? Now, to be fair, I started this a long time ago. This was my first book. It came out of my dissertation. And I didn't know when I started what would become many years of work, what minefields I could enter, right? So these challenges started with the reluctance of most contemporary Argentine Ashkenazim to focus on this topic, became more complicated with the kind of range of feminist and popular debates around prostitution or sex work and human trafficking, and the kind of varied political implications of this subject. And, you know, as folks here know, the history of Jewish prostitution continues to be well known and even still a source of shame among Argentine Jews themselves. Whereas for scholars and journalists with a more international audience, the subject has often been framed as kind of unknown or a silent story, and often exoticized, right? In part due to the minimal attention that Monica, pointed out, generally paid to the existence of Jewish populations in Latin America, much less to those doing things outside of the expected Jewish activity. And obviously the idea that Jews ran all international trafficking, an idea that the Nazis picked up, this was an exaggeration, right, which fit very nicely into older anti-Semitic tropes. But also to the extent to which sources are accessible, I share the findings of historians like Keely Stouter-Halstead, who works on the Polish and East Central European side, that there really was in this period, kind of the late 19th century through the interwar era, an overrepresentation of Ashkenazi Jewish traffickers or sex work managers, as well as Jewish women providing sex work on the ground in Argentina. And as I developed this project, as Mario said about his work, I thought it was really important to move beyond, continue to kind of move beyond the dichotomy, which has been critiqued in Jewish historiography since Salo Baron, of the lachrymose and the triumphalist, right? The tendencies to make Jews different from other groups, either as victims or as heroes, and instead to look at Jews as more similar than not to other groups of people, right, as non-exceptional. So I'll talk a little bit about these two sides, the heroic and the sort of victim side. So from Edward Bristow's work in the early 1980s, the heroic narrative has focused on the breadth and organization of Argentine Jewish opposition to Jewish-run prostitution, right? And in Argentina and around the world, Jewish community leaders were terrified that all Jews would be tied to sex work and their immigration and assimilation thereby restricted. So these kinds of self-protective fears prompted what we could call mainstream Argentine Jewish leaders to organize against Jewish sex work and make common cause with local and international reformers and authorities. And internationally, Jews worked both separately and together with other opponents of what was then called white slavery. But Argentine Jews were particularly aggressive and organized, right? Using the local Yiddish press, the legal system, and other forms of collective pressure to defend their community's reputation. And you may have heard the term tameim, right? It comes from the Yiddish, from the biblical Hebrew term for impure or ritually unclean. And this term was used as a kind of in-group code to refer to those involved in sex work. So I do look at this boycott and sort of broader mainstream Jewish institutional effort in my book, using sources from the Argentine Yiddish press as well as community archives. But rather than emphasizing how these good Jews triumphed over the bad Jews, I explore how this struggle was both an in-group and externally facing fight about not only who is a good Jew, but who is a Jew at all, right? Raising central questions of Jewish identity and legitimacy, defining acceptable limits of work and leisure, family structure, and religious expression. And I argue that this fight was crucial in shaping the identity and organizational development of certainly the Buenos Aires Ashkenazi community, if not Argentine Jewry more generally, which, as you all know, was at points in the past century the 5th largest Jewish community in the world. So here I am pushing a bit against some historians of Argentine Jewry who have tried to kind of minimize this topic by positioning the issue and the mainstream Jewish community's opposition as something of a colorful footnote to formal institutional formation, and often underscoring the shame that Jews were involved, in prostitution at all. On the victimization of Jewish women, my approach to the subject, which differentiates this book from much other scholarship and certainly popular culture on the topic, it's sort of grounded in an embrace of the insights into sex work, which have been promulgated by sex workers themselves and many scholars of the subject over the past several decades. I do use the terms prostitution and sex work somewhat interchangeably because most people are more familiar with the first term. I prefer the second. The creation in the 1970s and use of the term sex work is a political move that insists that this is a form of labor rather than always victimization. The latter is the position held by so-called radical feminists, among other groups. And parallel versions of this debate have occurred over the entire past 150 years internationally. Today, we generally react to the 1970s feminist debates tied to what were called the sex wars, right? On one side, this radical feminist position that prostitution is inherently exploitative versus the sex worker rights position coming from organizations of sex workers themselves, that the main problem is the conditions under which their labor is performed, right? The main danger is police and imprisonment of the wrong people. And bringing that to the present moment, recent legal changes like FOSTA, SESTA, getting rid of internet advertising, have been critiqued for making it really more dangerous for sex workers on the ground. And you all may or may not be aware that current anti-trafficking organizations are often associated with evangelical right-wing causes, and they tend to really sensationalize the sexual aspects and can really flatten people's lives, as well as distract from the far more prevalent forms of forced labor in the world today, which are not sexual. So I begin the book with a genealogy of the term white slavery, which was in international usage before the term trafficking. Among other arguments, I interrogate the racializing work done by this concept. And white slavery or trafficking was the biggest transnational women's organizing issue after the right to vote through the late 19th and early mid 20th century. And both contemporary observers and later scholars have argued that this problem's scale was really exaggerated, or at least the aspect of deception or kidnapping. Most women entered prostitution due to economic necessity and lack of other options, not because they were tricked or kidnapped. And when they're audible through generally heavily mediated archival sources, sex workers' own voices proclaim their agency, right? From among limited options, most people have made at least some of the decisions that lead into sex work. This is what comes from sources articulated by sex workers and managers themselves. Sex was often one of multiple economic strategies deployed at one time or over the course of a lifetime, despite the implication of kind of the permanent fall that's usually the sort of white slavery narrative. And so the idea is that most sex workers made certain choices along their migratory paths and continued to make choices after their fall. And then this white slave story was more palatable to almost everyone than the version articulated by sex workers and managers, right? So in this period, particularly for groups like Ashkenazi Jews with limited options, prostitution and its management provided one of the most lucrative occupational fields available to ambitious individuals with restricted choices on both sides of this migratory journey. And this is called, by contemporary feminist scholars, modified choice theory. People make the best of a bad set of choices. And I don't want to erase or minimize violence. Certainly violence permeated the world of sex work, but violence also reached and reaches into the supposedly protected domestic sphere and other arenas of women's labor. If we follow the theoretical move of thinking about prostitution as sex work, this period's international traffic becomes a gendered labor phenomenon, right? A way of interpreting women's half of this mass migration era. If prostitution is framed as a form of labor, then this period's so-called trafficking problem can be viewed as a big part of the female side of this massive migration out of industrializing and war-torn Europe. I also analyze in this book the regulation of trafficking, right? So, the regulation of trafficking in the past, as today, I argue had a lot to do with the management of migration more broadly, really trying to police desirable and undesirable migrants. I have some maps about this in the beginning of the book. So to conclude, I feel like part of the challenge of talking about this topic in Jewish studies, in addition to a sense in some circles that sexuality is a fringe or a niche subject, it's really because of the role of Jewish men as pimps and traffickers. How do we talk about them? How do we feel about them? Particularly if we want to be cautious about some of the more sensationalist approaches to, say, the Jewish gangster, right? How do we deal more generally with the complexity of Jewish actors who behaved in ways that their descendants weren't particularly proud of? And I don't know if you noticed the cover of my book. I had this interesting thing with the press. I got a little bit of an inadvertent nudge to use kind of a naked or a half-naked woman on the cover, as do nearly all books about prostitution and other forms of sex work, whether or not they're emphasizing women's victimhood. And despite this whole third wave sex work argument I just made, I was really raised by second wave feminists, and I could not put a naked lady on my book cover. But I insisted instead that these guys go on the cover, right? In part because the book is really about them. So on the cover I have some of the arrest photos from 1930 of some 100-odd members of the Varsovia Urzvi Magdal Society, which folks here probably know was this legal organization of Jewish pimps, brothel owners, and madams, which was centered in Buenos Aires from its foundation in 1906 until this court case in 1930. And I think my book gives more details on the structure and operations of this organization than you can find elsewhere. I connect their structure to the Landsmannschaften that Mario spoke to us about. I try to trace their actual international networks and their on-the-ground work structure, how they talked about their work, as well as others' ideas about them. And one of the big takeaways I hope people get from the book comes from the significance of talking about both the men and women involved in sex work in this context as non-exceptional immigrants. I raise, but I obviously can't solve this problem of how to assimilate their story into Argentine Jewish history more broadly. And this depends on what we think we're doing as Latin American Jewish studies scholars, right? How much we've internalized various kinds of often justifiable defensiveness, including the need to prove Jewish productivity, good forms of exceptionalism, the ability to assimilate. But as I frequently have to work to convince my students, philo-Semitism is really the flip side of anti-Semitism. My hope is that in continuing to do these kinds of social history that build empathy with the difficult decisions made by ordinary people, we can also help to push against the dangers of exceptionalism. Thank you. Nora, we can't hear you.
We can't hear you, Nora.
So now you can hear me? Okay. Yes, we'll leave all the questions for the end. And we have 3 more presenters. The next one will be Ariela Gugenheim, Boicot, el pleito de Echeverría con Israel, Nexos, publisher. Are you there, Ariela?
Sí, aquí estoy.
Muy bien, gracias.
Un segundo.
¿Tienes algo para mostrar?
No me di cuenta que ya me tocaba a mí algo. Se me fue mal el número. Queda un segundito y lo pongo, ¿sí? Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation to share my book with you. I am extremely interested in doing it. On November 10, 1975, the General Assembly of the United Nations passed Resolution 3379, condemning Zionism as a form of racism. Mexico voted in favor of the resolution. In retaliation, American Jews made a tourism boycott to Mexico. the Mexican psyche still remembers it painfully. My book tries to reconstruct the origin. Creo que no todos están en mute. To reconstruct the origin, development, and end of this event to better understand it, based on abundant and new documentary sources. It also shows that the tourism boycott known history is remembered in the Mexican collective memory was distorted. My original intention was to study the relationship between the Jews of Mexico and the Jews of the United States from various perspectives, institutional, family, economic, intellectual. This topic has aroused my interest for years. In 2012, I had already published one case study about this topic in Colegio de Mexico. Now I decided to start my work with one case study, the tourism boycott of 1975. When I began my research, many still remembered it, which caused a paradoxical situation. On the one hand, the topic seemed to be known, closed, but in reality, no one had studied it in depth. There were two excellent academic articles written on the subject, but they examined only external aspects of the event and were rather sociological in focus, not historical. Furthermore, as I would learn from the investigation, some of the givens about the boycott itself were mistaken. To delimit the object of study, I put aside the role of Israel. I focused the heart of the investigation in 6 months, June 1975, when the first condemnation to Zionism as racism in an international forum took place at the Women's Year Conference in Mexico City, to January 1976, when the tourism boycott was about to end. And still, the information was so large that I had to make the whole book only on that one case. The minute books of the Jewish Central Committee of Mexico and the Mexican newspapers of the time had already been consulted for these articles, but there were many virgin sources left for investigation, mainly the Ministry of Foreign Relations of Mexico, the Jewish organizations in the United States that had participated in the boycott, the Mexican Arab magazines, the Hemerography of the United States, the National Security Archives, and WikiLeaks. Surprisingly, WikiLeaks turned out to have a wealth of information for my research because it contained all the communications between the embassies of the United States, Mexico, and other countries with the United States State Department. Marginally, I also consulted the government archives of Israel, and in total, I reviewed more than 10,000 documents. I would want to highlight some of the main findings of my research. It is believed that Mexico's vote in favor of Resolution 3379 at the UN was surprising and unexpected for all those involved. However, I found that the behavior of Mexico and President Echeverría had a precedent. The Foreign Ministry and the President acted in the Women's Year Conference in a very similar way to their behavior in the vote on Resolution 3379 at the UN. There were the same attempts to sway the vote and the same false hopes as well. It could have been foreseen that Mexico would vote as it finally did. I found that Mexico was exposed to various pressures before voting in the UN in both directions, by governmental and non-governmental agents, nationals and foreigners. In the book, I analyze why the pressures seeking a negative vote were not sufficient. More than once, it has been suggested or affirmed that it was activists from the Jewish community's representative bodies in Mexico who proposed to the American Jews to carry out a boycott. The book shows that the idea of the boycott did not arise in the Jewish community of Mexico. On the contrary, Mexican Jewish leaders tried unsuccessfully to stop the boycott on numerous occasions, Still, just as they never had the necessary projection before the Mexican government to influence Mexico's vote at the UN, they also did not have the required influence on the Jewish community in the United States to curb their pressure on Mexico. Since the major Jewish organizations in the United States eventually joined the boycott, many thought they were the ones who started it. However, the boycott originated from ordinary people, not from leaders or any particular organization. In fact, this was the first significant display of the people power of the Jewish community of the United States. It was a spontaneous and visceral reaction of individual people to what they perceived as a betrayal of Mexico. In the book, I explain why there was such a passionate and vehement response from ordinary men and women. The most important Jewish organizations in the United States took over the leadership only after the boycott had already begun. However, once they took control, they handled well the pressure on Mexico. The boycott is remembered as Jewish. The Jews of the United States were indeed its leading promoters, but many non-Jewish Americans, among them even some of Mexican origin, joined the boycott. On December 12, 1975, as a result of the boycott, a group of Jews from the United States arrived in Mexico to meet privately with President Echeverría and evaluate whether they would stop or not the tourism boycott. It was not the Jews of Mexico who arranged for the invitation. Echeverría himself insisted on this visit until the American group agreed to come. The book explains the origin of this highly irregular encounter and its development and everything that went on in it. The Jewish American group meeting with the Mexican president highlighted the disparate relationship between the Jewish communities in the United States and in Mexico. It is a sample of the authoritarian behavior and condescendence with which the American Jews related to their Mexican counterparts. One of the most important discoveries of my research was that the Mexican government's relationship toward the Jewish community in Mexico changed after the boycott. The Jewish community of the United States, display of power radiated strength to the Jewish community in Mexico vis-a-vis its government. For example, the Jews of Mexico had been requesting an interview with President Echeverría for 3 months before the United Nations vote. They were not able even to obtain a formal response. Nevertheless, their tourism boycott made them so relevant that the president himself invited them to a meeting. Before the boycott, the Mexican Jewish community had some relationship with the government, for sure, but it was always through personal channels. After the boycott, the ties became institutionalized. Among other things, the presidency invited them to the inauguration of Mexico's next president and granted 400 new citizenships to the community, all through the Central Committee. Paradoxically, the relationship between the Mexican and the American Jewish communities changed also due to the boycott. The Mexican Jewish community's empowerment affected its relations with both the Mexican government and the American Jewish institutions. My work reveals a page of history that had been dormant for almost half a century. It is about power and the abuse of it. It analyzes the relationship between two Jewish communities, between each other and vis-a-vis their governments. It is also a story of trust and betrayal, which sheds light on Mexico and the United States relations. It also shows what a group of ordinary citizens can achieve when they commit to a common goal. In my very biased opinion, it is a very fascinating story. And even though I wrote it with academic rigor, I have been told it grabs the reader. Boicot was published in Mexico, and fortunately, it has received good reviews in various academic journals. I want to translate it into English, probably shifting the focus slightly from the Mexican Jewish community to the American one. I am working on it now, and I am extremely interested in this forum's advice on how to make it more attractive to an American audience. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ariela. Hope we'll have some response after we finish. We'll continue now with Alan Astro, who will present on his name and on Malena Chinsky on splendor, decline, and rediscovery of Yiddish in Latin America. Alan?
Yes, Nora, could you allow me to share the screen? You could do it from the share screen button too.
Yes, share screen. What's that? Co-host. Yes, I have to make you co-host. Wait a second.
It's another way of doing it, but that's okay.
Yes, yes. Well, let me see. I have to point out to you first. Let me see you. Let me find you again. Here you are. And now I press use the buttons. Just 1 second and make you co-host. Good. Here we are.
Okay.
All yours.
Okay. I am a this will. Okay. Yes. Okay.
Make it bigger.
Yes. Well, this is okay. Yes. This is.
Make it bigger.
This is our book, Malena Chinsky, and my book. Do you hear me? Okay, everybody. Yes.
Yes, we hear.
Okay. Yes, it's called Splendor, Decline, and Rediscovery of Yiddish in Latin America. I'll explain the cover in a second. It's a edited volume with several people whom a lot of you will know. Actually, let me switch this again. Okay. Here, this is, okay. This is the, okay, this is a book in the series by Ranan Rein, and you can see a lot of names that many of you know who are part of the editorial board, including the late Edna Eisenberg. And as our book shows, and I'm just very happy that Mariusz's book received such recognition, because it shows the importance of using Yiddish sources in the study of Latin American Jewish communities. And I'll just go quickly down the list of the people who, and the articles in our introduction, we talked about the question of what does this rediscovery mean, and what is post-vernacular Yiddish and its echoes, or it's the forms it takes rather, in Latin America. And okay, you can see we started with Brazil, which of course doesn't always get the attention it deserves in this matter, and Ronnie Citranovich, who of course has done many things with other people in LAJSA, and whose mother is the perhaps major Portuguese translator of Yiddish. Ronnie spends a lot of time talking about the particularities of Yiddish in Brazil compared to that in neighboring Argentina. Malena's article talks about something very interesting, which is the arrival of Yiddish intellectuals, artists, writers after the war, many of whom were in Paris. These were people generally who survived in the Soviet Union and then left Eastern Europe for very many obvious reasons, ended up as refugees in Paris, and Argentina's Jewish community organized, bringing them over as fresh creative energies. Actually, Malena talks about the fact that a lot of these people were hardly spring chickens, as we used to say. I don't know if we still say it. And how this, what this said about the relations between the Argentine Jewish community and its government under Perón at the time. The next piece by Israelo Katz-Lotterstein, which is about the way that the Jewish communist Ikuf really followed Soviet marching orders in marginalizing, or worse, Yiddish culture and the Yiddish language, and extending these things to Argentina. Of course, obviously, that's a very conflictual moment in Jewish history. Actually, Tamara, here we have someone who's probably our youngest researcher in the book, wrote a very interesting piece on a forgotten novel, as many of the things we work on are largely forgotten, unfortunately. And this book it brings to light some things that people do not know about the Mexican Jewish community, which is, for example, attempts at agricultural colonization, agricultural settlement in Mexico. Of course, that's usually associated with Argentina, occasionally Brazil, and also Jewish prostitution in Mexico. And actually what Ariela was just talking about, the book talks a lot about the relations between the American Jewish community and these initiatives on the Mexican Jewish community's part. And the next one I see that Susana is in the audience, and her and Lucas Fishman's piece talks about the question of a kind of criollista literature in Yiddish as well. And also something that interested me very much in that piece is specific comments, specific insights into Yiddish as used in agricultural colonies in Argentina. And rather amusingly, of course, there's the name of the book, El Linchero, because as we know, it's El Linchera in Spanish, but obviously either the typesetter, which was always the joke about, if there's anything wrong in the Yiddish text, he blamed the typesetter, Habucha Hazetza, as he was called, the kind of macaronic Hebrew expression. And so in Yiddish, obviously decided, well, in Spanish, masculine nouns, and with O, so it has to be linchero and not linchera. So next is my talk about some writers Yiddish writers in Uruguay. Obviously, very often Uruguay ends up being kind of, colony of Yiddish Argentina. And they're, however, talking about some particularities. And also, it's interestingly, both Zittner and Verblum ended up making Aliyah. And this is also a question which probably has not gotten as much interest as it could, is the question of, it has in certain except not regarding Latin America, Yiddish in Israel, which obviously we all know about the fact that, there was very much pressure against the use of Yiddish, against Yiddish culture, against Yiddish theater in Israel, but there were also contrary stories, such as that of Avram Sutzkever, who managed to carve out a niche for Yiddish in Israel. And these two writers, for example, continued being active, especially Zittner. And Zittner also actually the other important Yiddish writer, the important Latin American Yiddish writer in Israel who moved and stayed in Israel is Yana Sovich, and who also probably should be, needs a little more attention. And actually, Zittner also talks about the Baal Tshuva phenomenon, actually very early, before anybody knew there was going to be a kind of great Baal Tshuva movement, which is quite interesting. The next one, of course, is by someone whom many of you know, whose work is very important, Perla Sneh, about her father. Indeed, a lot of these people we talk, actually, for example, Kacho's article was also very personal about his work, because he was a teacher in the equal schools. And Perla, obviously speaking about her father, very important figure, a crossover phenomenon. I think there's only two Yiddish writers who really also became writers in Spanish. One of them is Simcha Sneh, the other one, as Naomi has spoken about in her very important book, Jose Rabinovich. And this is, and unfortunately, Simcha Sneh's work is really not known. El Pan y la Sangre actually Daryl has written about Simchisne's work in Spanish, and I urge you to read it. The next article is by Javier Sinai, the author of a book which became something of a bestseller in this niche, which was Los Crímenes de Moses Vische, about his great-grandfather, who was a significant, essentially the founder of Yiddish journalism in Argentina. And that book is very personal about his great-grandfather. And also this one, he imagines Pina Katz, who was, among other things, the Yiddish translator of Don Quixote. It's a kind of somewhat novelistic, but still historical and journalistic creation. And by the way, he won the, not for Los Crímenes de Moses Vische, but he won the Garcia Marquez Prize for journalism a few years ago for a piece he wrote for Rolling Stone. Then another important member of LAJSA, Rosa Perlmutter, about, and then this is also somewhat personal, her it's someone that she knew. It's not about her, it's about someone she knew, a writer, Aronofsky, very interesting figure who spoke in his poetry, among other things, about national heroes of Cuba, Antonio Maceo and Jose Marti. And Aronofsky was probably the Yiddish writer who remained longest in Cuba, well after the revolution until 1980. Finally, Hevel Katz's, many of you know his song Mosesville, and actually Ariel does a great deal of archival research about different versions of songs by Hevel Katz, and also the legend that grew up that somehow he was called the Jewish Gardel. He couldn't find anything in the Yiddish press of the time or in the Spanish language press of the time calling him that. So this was kind of like a post-myth about Hevel Katz. And then finally, I would like to show you our cover, because I personally am somewhat proud of the cover, which had this sign, Billig wie Bosch, from Corrientes. I was walking down in 2014, and there was a store there kind of selling, kind of like this dollar store kind of place. And it kind of fascinated me, first of all, that it wasn't borscht, because Yiddish is very heavily consonantal, whereas Spanish is heavily vocalic, so all those consonants at the end didn't really work together. And the fact that this is obviously in Latin letters, not in Yiddish, not in Hebrew letters, I thought also said something about the remembrance and the forgetting of Yiddish at the same time. In Argentina, I walked into the store, of course, and I tried speaking some Yiddish to them, and of course, there was some recognition of it, but no. And I said, well, what about the name of the store? Who knows what it means? And so the response was like, Gente de la Colectividad was what I was told. But in any case, I just thought it seemed like, and actually the fact, I kind of think allegorically, this store, the name of it suggests that these dollar items, of course, they're really saying is they're worth more than $1. You're getting a bargain. And so likewise, working on Yiddish is something which has been essentially dumped up to, largely in Yiddish, in Jewish history. And then obviously just working on it, discovering something that turns out to be worth much more than what is thought. And so thank you for this chance to talk about our work, and that's it.
Thank you. Okay.
Nora,
no se te escucha.
I put, ¿ahora se me escucha? Now? Can you hear me now?
Sí.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much, Alan. The next presenter will be, and the last one, Enrique Martínez Ruiz, Quintación, los judíos y la conformación del espacio urbano en Bogotá. Let me find you, Enrique.
Acá estoy.
Sí, Enrique.
Acá estoy.
A ver, Enrique.
Ya, ¿me oyes?
Quería ahí, está un titito.
Aquí estoy, aquí estoy.
Pero ¿por qué no? Un momento otra vez. A ver, Ricardo, Enrique.
Acá, acá, acá.
Más a la izquierda, a ver. Un segundito. ¿Veo? Ahí está, ahí estamos, ok. Entonces ahora, ¿quieres que ponga share, no?
No, no hay necesidad.
Gracias.
Listo, bueno, buenas tardes. Bueno, muchas gracias a LAJSA por la invitación para presentar mi libro. Este es el libro que voy a presentar. Se llama Quintación, los judíos y la conformación del espacio urbano de Bogotá. Y pues antes que nada les quiero explicar el título. Bueno, y está la portada de una casa, que realmente está de quintación, es una casa quinta que construyó el inmigrante judío Joseph Eidelman, que llega a Bogotá a finales de 1918, hace un siglo, justamente cuando se está terminando la epidemia de fiebre española, que de hecho él estaba muy flaco en Bogotá y creían que había adquirido la fiebre y pues no era cierto, era porque era muy kosher, era muy observante y no podía comer en Bogotá. Bueno, y ahí empiezan muchas historias. En todo caso, él se convierte dentro de todos los negocios que realiza en Bogotá. Uno es la urbanización de barrios, y para promover la urbanización del barrio que él funda en 1919, 2 meses después de que llega a Bogotá, construye esta pequeña casita a la que hace llamar Quintación, la Casa Quintación. Y tiene como detalle particular esta estrella de David sobre la puerta donde se ve a su esposa, Rosa Bernal de Eidelman, probablemente la primera mujer conversa a causa de estas, conversa el judaísmo a causa de estas migraciones del siglo XX, posando en la entrada de la casa que construye Alberto Manrique Martín, favorito de la comunidad judía durante estos años. El diseño, por ejemplo, del Colegio Colombo-Hebreo también, la primera edificación de carácter judío que se levanta en Bogotá en 1948. Y pues me gustó mucho el título, Quintación, porque ejemplifica muy bien lo que es este libro, una historia urbana de Bogotá, las casas quintas, digamos, de una historia del proceso de urbanización, pero por el otro lado da cuenta de la historia judía en Bogotá. Y esta estrella de David que está ahí, se me olvidó decirles, probablemente es uno de esos primeros símbolos de identidad judía que se colocan en el espacio público de la ciudad, que se exhiben por primera vez, porque pues acá, como en otras partes de América Latina, pues ser judío era un problema y en el siglo XIX lo siguió siendo. Todos los inmigrantes judíos que llegaron a la ciudad en el siglo XIX terminaron asimilándose y si no ellos, pues sus hijos ya fueron bautizados. Bueno, antes de seguir, pues debo decir que este trabajo de investigación se publicó en el 2018 por la Pontificia Universidad Javeriana, pero en realidad se elaboró entre el 2007 y 2010, que en el marco de la maestría en Historia y Teoría del Arte, la Arquitectura y la Ciudad de la Universidad Nacional de Colombia, de donde soy egresado como antropólogo, y constituyó el punto de partida para la investigación doctoral en la Universidad de Tel Aviv, bajo la supervisión del profesor Ranan Rein, que busca el origen de esta relación entre inmigrantes judíos e inversiones inmobiliarias en Bogotá. En realidad, el origen de esta investigación fue saber si existieron o no barrios judíos en Bogotá, porque pues ya para ese momento sabía que en Buenos Aires existían, en México existen, en Ciudad de México, y en otras ciudades de la región, donde se sabe dónde se han concentrado los judíos en las ciudades cuando han llegado, en sus principales ciudades, pero en el caso bogotano no. Entonces empecé a indagar y no he encontrado respuesta y por eso decidí embarcarme en esta investigación. Sin embargo, nunca la pude completar porque estaba buscando los barrios, pero también las pautas de asentamiento, ¿no? Cuando llegan están en el centro de la ciudad y luego se van desplazando hacia el norte, donde también se establece la clase media alta y la élite de la ciudad. Y por lo ambicioso del proyecto, pues no lo pude terminar, entonces tuve que parar, ver qué llevaba, y lo que encontré, pues es la hipótesis principal del libro, que es que las inversiones inmobiliarias fueron una estrategia étnica desplegada masivamente por los inmigrantes judíos que llegaron a Bogotá durante la primera mitad del siglo XX para reconstruir su vida a nivel individual y comunitario, al tiempo que para insertarse dentro de la sociedad local. ¿Y por qué digo estrategia étnica? Esto es algo que no está en el libro, esto es algo que mucho tiempo después he podido ver, y es que en realidad ningún otro grupo de inmigrantes participó de una forma tan numerosa en el mercado inmobiliario de la ciudad. Cuando yo hacía la revisión de las cédulas catastrales, el fondo documental privilegiado para realizar esta investigación, pues efectivamente me encontré sirio-libaneses, me encontré franceses, alemanes, ingleses, españoles, vascos, recuerdo, italianos no judíos, que invirtieron en el espacio de la ciudad. Pero eran unos cuantos nombres, es decir, incluso yo puedo hablar de las familias sirio-libanesas, todavía me acuerdo de sus apellidos, los Moanak, los Chalhub, los Akel, y son así, son contadas con los dedos. Pero para mi sorpresa, en el centro de la ciudad prácticamente no existe, en el centro histórico de la ciudad, es decir, la Bogotá que llega a comienzos del siglo XX, que es casi el mismo marco colonial. Para mi sorpresa, casi en ninguna de estas manzanas, en cada una de estas manzanas había invertido por lo menos un inmigrante judío, fuera comprando un lote o incluso construyendo edificios de más de 100 apartamentos. Y eso pues fue verdaderamente sorpresivo. ¿Por qué los judíos y por qué tanto? Ese se volvió el origen de la investigación doctoral. Por eso también digo que masivamente, porque no fueron unos cuantos, fueron todos. Bueno, no todos, pero un gran número. Y esta estrategia, junto con otras estrategias, les permitió a ellos, a los inmigrantes judíos, realmente sufrir o experimentar un gran enriquecimiento que en 20 años los llevó de pasar vendedores ambulantes, los clappers, a sentarse en la mesa con el presidente en el 47, 48, a ejercer influencia dentro del gobierno nacional para el voto que Colombia iba a dar sobre la creación o no del Estado de Israel, por ejemplo. Esa y otras materias de política exterior, pero también nacionales. Es decir, en 20 años la comunidad judía se experimenta un enriquecimiento grandísimo, se enclasa, se vuelve parte de la élite, creaban muchas empresas, da mucho empleo, y eso les permite reconstruirse, y las inversiones inmobiliarias hacen parte de las estrategias que usaron para alcanzar esa transformación, y eso les permite cambiar su vida, pero también construir una comunidad. No por nada es justamente en el 48, cuando empieza la época de gran esplendor de la comunidad judía, cuando se funda el Colegio Colombo Hebreo, y luego 4 años después se funda la primera sinagoga en la historia de Bogotá, en sus casi ya 500 años. Solamente después de más de 400 años se funda un templo religioso no cristiano, y eso pues marca un antes y un después en la historia de la ciudad. Y al tiempo pues se encuentran en un lugar. Ahora, ¿por qué es importante analizar este caso de las inversiones inmobiliarias? Porque aquí existía, con los pocos trabajos que se habían hecho de investigación sobre los inmigrantes judíos, siempre habían dicho pues, que fueron primero vendedores ambulantes, que dan después paso al comercio formal y luego se vuelven industriales. Un lugar común o algo pues, que yo creo que es cierto, pero que hay que investigar más, es que la historia judía de los judíos en Colombia es, antes que nada, una historia empresarial. La historia de cada una de las familias que se establecen acá, en la mayoría de los casos, está asociada a la fundación de una empresa muy exitosa. Y eso no es cualquier cosa, es una comunidad pequeñita, pero que creó muchas empresas y creó muchos empleos. Cada vez que yo cuento la historia de la cantidad de marcas que han acompañado nuestras vidas, de marcas de distinto tipo de productos, productos de limpieza, productos de aseo, mobiliario para el hogar, ropa, incluso, que han sido fundadas por judíos, pues nadie se lo cree porque nadie aquí lo sabe, o no ha tenido el ojo para verlo. Entonces, es una historia que sobre todo empresarial, y ha sido así, pero dentro de ese portafolio de inversiones empresariales o de emprendimientos empresariales, sin duda las inversiones inmobiliarias jugaron un papel muy importante y pues hasta la fecha, hasta esta investigación, no habían sido estudiadas. Del mismo modo, yo pues cada vez que he participado en LAJSA y he contado distintos aspectos de esta historia, tampoco he encontrado que en América Latina se haya hecho una investigación parecida. Yo me imagino que en Argentina tiene que haber pasado algo así. Entonces, es decir, los judíos colombianos, la comunidad judía colombiana contemporánea se comienza a conformar justamente en el momento que Bogotá empieza a experimentar una gran expansión urbana, que es más o menos 1919, es el final de la Primera Guerra Mundial, y toda la década del 20 es una historia de nuevos barrios por todas partes, y un pequeño grupo de judíos entró en ese negocio también a fundar barrios obreros en toda la periferia de la ciudad. Yo me pregunto cómo ocurrió eso en Argentina. ¿Participaron de la misma manera? ¿Fueron masivos? ¿Compartieron esta experiencia con otras comunidades de inmigrantes? Bueno, y para contar esa historia, pues yo básicamente conté la experiencia que tuve al hacer esta investigación. Entonces este libro es un libro que son dos libros. El primero es una búsqueda de la presencia de los judíos en Bogotá desde la colonia, que ya sabemos que hubo judíos haciendo Shabbat en la calle principal de la ciudad colonial en 1650 y un expediente de la Inquisición, de unos procesados de la Inquisición que dan cuenta. Luego viene, que es una historia pues, de ocultamiento. Luego viene la historia del siglo XIX, que es la historia de unos primeros inmigrantes sefaradíes que nacían, digamos que aunque oficialmente pueden profesar su religión, realmente no lo pueden hacer porque sigue siendo una sociedad muy conservadora, profundamente católica y con un antisemitismo latente que estalla cada vez que se manifiesta otras formas de incluso cristianismo, ¿no? Aquí los protestantes, los anglicanos que llegaron con la Legión Británica y que se establecieron en Bogotá luchando con el ejército de Bolívar, se los llamaba herejes. Y tuvo que crearse un cementerio para esos herejes, que es el cementerio británico de Bogotá, que terminó recibiendo también a algunos de estos judíos que se establecieron en la ciudad en el siglo XIX. Esa es una historia de asimilación. Y finalmente está la historia de las comunidades del siglo XX, la historia de las sinagogas, los colegios, los centros comunitarios, la casa de adulto mayor, y bueno, que es ya la historia de la visibilidad completa en la ciudad. Esa es la primera parte, es también una historia urbana, pero es la historia de la forma como ellos se apropiaron del espacio urbano en distintos momentos de la historia bogotana. Y la segunda parte del libro es el estudio del mercado inmobiliario en Bogotá durante la República y la manera como los inmigrantes judíos entraron, se volvieron protagonistas y realmente definieron la forma pues, del lugar, los trazados y el aspecto del tejido urbano de vastos sectores de la capital colombiana. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias a ti. Muchas gracias, Enrique. Ahora te toca escribir el libro sobre la formación de la colectividad ¿verdad? La próxima, para compararlo con la de Colombia. Así que,
claro.
libro. Muchas gracias. Ahora, ¿cómo vuelvo aquí? A ver. ¿Me pueden ver? Bueno, no sé, estoy haciéndolo aquí. Bueno, lo que quería agradecerles a todos ustedes, entonces, hemos tenido una gran diversa exposición de lo antropológico, histórico, cultural, étnico, literario. Estos libros, cada uno de ellos nos aporta otro mensaje y mucho para leer y para poder digerir con el tiempo. Así que espero que podamos comprar tus libros, si tienen todos los datos, ¿verdad? De cada uno de ustedes. Cualquier cosa me escriben y se los mando. ¿Dónde estoy yo acá? Bueno, ahora lo que quería pasar era preguntas de los participantes, entre ustedes mismos o con el público. A ver cómo hacemos ahora. Espera para ver. Share screen. No. ¿Alguien quiere comenzar con preguntas? A ver, ¿me pueden oír? Gina? Can you not hear me? Can you hear me? ¿Qué pasa?
¿Para qué estás compartiendo pantalla, Nora?
Quiero que puedan hacer preguntas. You are welcome to questions between each other, with each other, or comments from everybody here. I can see you if you have anything to ask or to the participants. Anybody? Can I ask? Can I start? Can you hear me?
Yes.
You can hear me well. My question to Mir particularly, because I'm closest to your subject. Mir, you presented in English. ¿Prefieres que hable español o inglés? I can't hear you.
No se te oye.
I mean, I would prefer to speak English, but I can speak in Spanish, or you can speak Spanish and I can speak English, or I can speak in Spanish less well than I speak in English.
Okay, my question was regarding the number of slave workers coming from France and from other countries to Argentina. They, of course, was a choice of the women themselves. Whereas with Jewish women, many times they were brought, of course, on pretense that they were going to achieve something or become somebody when they arrived in Argentina. what is did you see any statistics versus because you contend that many of them did it out of their choice because of economic situation. They were forced to, they themselves were volunteering to become sex workers. So did you have any statistics to show that the number was larger of women willingly entering the trade?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is impossible to collect statistics on. I mean, it's very, very difficult to even have numbers of how many people are involved at all in something like this. The numbers, the closest thing to numbers we have are coming from the numbers of people who were, working in registered brothels in the legal system in Buenos Aires. That number is only a small percentage of the total number of people who are working, clandestinely. I certainly spent time in the police archives, also in immigration archives, trying to track different people from one end of the Atlantic Ocean to the other. So I mean, getting statistics is not remotely possible. As far as, I'm trying to make, I think, a slightly more nuanced argument, which is not that, every Jewish woman who ended up in a brothel in Buenos Aires was there entirely out of her own free will, but rather that the story that is told over and over again, including in novels and plays and popular culture to this day, of this handsome, wealthy stranger showing up in the neighboring hometown that he comes from in the the neighboring shtetl, and he's now a wealthy merchant in Buenos Aires, and then he falls in love with the daughter and convinces the parents to also fall in love with him, and sort of marries her and takes her back. And then she realizes at the very last moment that she's being imprisoned in a brothel. My sense from the sources that I'm using is that that story was generally far more complicated on the ground than the narratives would suggest, right? Not that every individual made every choice along the way of that journey. That maybe, often people made one step of the journey at a time. They might have known one part of what they were getting themselves into, right? Not exactly what it was going to look like. But again, the sources that I'm using for that, I use a lot of the League of Nations sources from the archives in Geneva. Were really fascinating on the ground sources about the trafficking. There were these folks who did this amazing research for several years in the mid-1920s, kind of this multilingual guy, Kinsey, who went around the world speaking multiple languages, pretending he wanted to traffic women and trying to investigate by getting to know pimps, madams, prostitutes, sort of investigating, were people being trafficked against their will or not? Now, a lot of those sources are very mediated, right? So very, you hear that's closer to getting to the voices of the women involved than most other sources. But again, statistics are impossible. It's impressionistic. But certainly many of the folks in those sources who speak, keeping in mind for what reason they're being recorded, which is to prove that there was a lot of involuntary trafficking, not much is found, right, of involuntary trafficking by people who are seeking it. Now, this guy happened to be real friendly with pimps, brothel owners, who were also telling him a certain story, right? But neither he nor the Jewish Association for the Protection of Girls and Women were really able to rescue anywhere close to the number of people they tried to rescue, right? So, this is very controversial, right? This has to do with how you see the entire endeavor, but also the challenges of the archival sources themselves.
Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else would like to ask questions? Let me, if you unmute yourself and will hear. Hello? Do I hear anyone else? No? Okay. If there are no more questions, I would like to announce that you have another event coming up on the 21st, I think, for LAJSA. I hope you will be able to join us. El tercer encuentro del Foro de Investigadores. El tercer encuentro del Foro de Investigadores sobre Judaísmo de América Latina, el jueves 21 de enero a las 16:30, hora israelí. En New York es más o menos a las 10:30, Texas a las 9:30, el próximo encuentro. Así que muchas gracias a todos por las presentaciones y por lo que nos enseñaron hoy, y espero verlos pronto en otras reuniones. Adiós a todos. Adiós. No los oigo.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. Thank you.